let's look at some of the considerations. So I'm drawing this spatial cluster as if these are sort of spaces that have connectivity between them. These smaller gray circles right here are here to represent sort of smaller subdivision spaces within a larger space. So the first thing that I consider when I create any sort of cluster of spaces like this is the entrance node. So what do I want the player to be presented with the very first sort of image composition? And it very well may be from sort of this position right here. This isn't sort of a strict thing that we sort of force the player to this point. Sometimes that is the case. We sort of force the player to enter here. But even if this was sort of an open world setting where this was a town, if you present this sort of entrance right here as the intended entrance, it'll come across to the player that this is sort of the intended sort of approach to here. So imagine maybe this is sort of, we're playing Skyrim or something like that, and this is a village, and there's a big tower right here, that the castle keep or something like that. So even if you do approach the village this way, there's this sort of strong path that we could have through here that very much sort of communicates to the player that this is the intended route for visitors to take. So anyway, so it's an entrance node where we really want to set up a really strong composition, such as this, for instance. So even if you sort of enter from the side, you see this, you come across this path and realize, oh, I must have come on the side of sort of this path. This is sort of the main presentation of it. So, and this is from sort of the entry perspectives where we especially sort of use our sort of focal guides, our framing, our element orientation to sort of basically create that opening composition that sort of gives us an understanding of the space. All right, so moving on, player directive. So in any space, when the player enters and we see this sort of entry composition, the player automatically sort of is directed to explore the space one way or another. So we talked a lot about that in a couple of lectures ago when we talked about sort of spatial design. How do the shapes of the walls, the normals, sort of guide the player's eye and therefore their action? Where are they going to be sort of spending their time? Where are they going to be exploring? So a space, especially that initial sort of setup, is really important, because if it's the first time the player has sort of entered in this space, you're sort of wanting to set up I guess the purpose of this space. This is the first time they've been introduced to the space. This is the first time we want to start talking about what is the purpose of this space, and where is the sort of the shape of this space sort of drawing us to. And that's a great sort of thing to talk about, is basically the focal elements, which is the next thing. So focal elements in a static image, of course, you generally have one focal element per scene. A lot of times for spatial composition, we end up with sort of one sort of focal element per major space, and then maybe a focal element that sort of shows where we are in the overall sort of space. So as you can see right here, represented by these sort of pink stars, I've got a somewhat sort of pretty important. I'm kind of using size of these stars to sort of indicate like how important or how major of sort of focal elements are here. So essentially this main opening space right here, which has a lot of importance and sort of all of the spaces sort of relate to it, has a very strong sort of focal element that I would probably use as sort of the focal element for this opening image right here, with sort of like guiding lines and framing to try to show, hey, this space is all about this one particular focal element. But I would probably also include in this sort of directive right here, maybe a view of this far off sort of, maybe this is a tower that I'm seeing, and I'm realizing that, okay, that's maybe a goal that I'm eventually trying to get to. and the space is sort of directing me, guiding me towards that. But you know, I have the option of the player to sort of also see these side paths, so I'm going to go and explore in here. What's really nice about, what's great about focal elements is sort of that it really sort of I guess grounds each of these spaces, or helps to create an identity, a purpose for each of these spaces. So as you come into here, you know, maybe these focal elements aren't exactly huge interesting things. Maybe as you come into this space down here, it's just a really interesting tree, but it's a sort of a local landmark that tells you what this space is about and helps to sort of set up good image compositions as you enter into this space. Fourth design element, finally, we want to talk about for spatial design is sort of the organization. And so when I'm talking about spatial organization, specifically structural organization, there's sort of two parts to this, and we're going to go into a lot more detail on those. One is hierarchy. So this is sort of a spatial cluster. We could also sort of define sort of smaller spatial clusters of identity within this. And then as we do, we sort of ask, you know, what is the purpose of these spaces? How do they sort of relate to one another? And what sets them off as different from these other spaces? So as we come into this space, we can see like, okay, maybe this is the sort of major sort of town square, and this is sort of like a I don't know, a small sort of subdivision of this space, but it very much relates to sort of this town square space. We may have sort of these each of these spaces sort of have their own identity and feel like they're sort of part of the overall whole, but sort of maybe in here we have, maybe as an example, these could be a number of different like shops. These are the weapon shops. Here's the sort of I don't know, factory area, that sort of thing. Within sort of these smaller sort of spaces, there could even be more sort of areas of identity within them. So that's sort of a structural organization of hierarchy here. And then other part of sort of structural organization is sort of organizing rules, what directs sort of the orientation of these spaces. So we'll get into that in a moment. So each of these spaces around these clusters will each have their sort of setups of hierarchy and identity within them. So, you know, essentially every sort of space we go into sort of has this sort of structure. So let's go a little bit more into this idea of organization.